Cool. I'll be talking about our work on domain and task-informed sample selection for cross-domain target-based sentiment analysis. This is work done in collaboration with my colleagues Rashmi and Smaranda. So the motivation for this work was, it stemmed from challenges we encounter during cross-domain targeted sentiment analysis. So most of us are aware, of course, and leading up from the previous talk as well, targeted sentiment analysis aims to detect sentiments towards specific targets in a given document. So given this example of a restaurant review, the various targets being addressed here are service, decor, food, and portions. There are various sentiment expressions associated with these targets. In this case, the words in italics, excellent, great, delicious, and small are the sentiment expressions. And as we can see, the sentiments associated with each target is also quite different. So while service, decor, and food have a positive sentiment, portions have been provided a negative sentiment. A similar notion can be checked with the lactose review as well. Here, the target being addressed is operating system. The sentiment expression is old, and we have a negative sentiment associated with the target. So from these examples, it must be evident to you that domain differences for this particular task affects both target types and sentiment expressions. So in the restaurant domain, we may have target types related to food, ambience, service, and therefore the corresponding sentiment expressions could be words such as delicious, fancy, attentive, etc. When we move to a different domain, both target types as well as sentiment expressions tend to change. Now for this task, For this particular task, obtaining fine-grained sentiment annotations for each specific span of text is quite expensive. It's time-consuming, it requires a lot of domain expertise, which is why most often in the real world, the scenario we have at hand is that we have a source domain where we may have ample label data available, but then we have target domains which are significantly different to the source domain. But there we may have very limited or no label data available at all. So in our work, we propose a sample selection strategy for cross-domain targeted sentiment analysis that does not require sentiment labels, but just the targets. And it's guided by both the dimensions of domain difference that we saw a slide ago. Let me now walk you through the sampling strategy itself. So our sampling methodology focuses on two aspects of the domain difference. It tries to select samples that are both informative and representative of the target domain. Now, informativeness is a commonly used criteria for active learning-based settings. In our problem, we use uncertainty or entropy-based sampling to be able to sample documents that contain targets that the model is most uncertain about in its sentiment predictions. So this results in selecting documents with hard to classify target spans. How this works is in the following manner. So let's say we have training data in the source and target domains. As I mentioned earlier, we have ample label data in a source domain. We train a model on that source domain training data. Now, having gotten that model, we can use it to predict probability distribution over sentiment labels for every target span for each document in the target domain. We can now use these predictions to compute a document level entropy score, which is the average entropy over all target spans. So as you can see here, h of xj is the entropy of the model on the target span xj. D of H represents the document level entropy score, which is simply the average entropy over all of these target spans in the given document. So essentially, any document that has a higher entropy score indicates that it's likely to have target spans that the model is more uncertain about and finds harder to classify. For the representativeness criteria, we basically look at a relative salience-based sampling in order to be able to extract sentiment expressions that are representative of the target domain. Relative salience essentially has been used in a past ACL 2011 paper to measure the extent to which an emotion is present in one text over the other. The way we use it in this setting is we start with a simplifying assumption that sentiment expressions majorly are expressed through adjectives. So we extract the adjectives out first using a parts of speech tagger. And then for each cross-domain setting that we experiment with, we compute the relative salience of every adjective. And we therefore then select documents containing any of the top 10 adjectives with the highest relative salience score. The final sampling strategy overall combines both of these approaches. So we first pick top K documents based on the entropy score and the rest from the relative salience set. Once we make this selection from the target domain training data, we then further train our model on these selected samples. Here's a brief look at the data sets we use for this study. So we look at the usual academic data sets that are used for this problem. So we have SemiVal 2016 restaurants review data set represented as R going forth. We have SemiVal 2014 laptops review data and a Twitter data set. I'm showing you here the data statistics of these three data sets as well. By document here, we refer to each sentence of a review for the restaurants and laptops case, and a single tweet for the Twitter data. We experiment with 3 cross-domain settings for this work. So what this means essentially is that in the first case, R2L, the source domain is restaurants, the target domain is laptops. We have the reverse case for L2R, and for L2T, the source domain is laptops and the target domain is Twitter. Now let's take a look at some of the highest scoring relative salience words for each of these settings. So in the R2L case, you can see that the higher scoring relative salience words, a few of them were words such as easy, new, old, etc. For L2R, words such as delicious, attentive came up to be the highest scoring RS words. What this essentially tells us is that these are the sentiment expressions that emerged as being more representative of the target domain. For example, the words delicious and attentive are sentiment expressions that are more likely to occur in the restaurants domain, especially when compared to the laptops domain. We also see here a few selected samples from each of the 2 sampling strategies. So as expected, the relative salience-based sampling strategy picks documents containing these high scoring relative salience words. For example, in the R2L case, it's picked a document containing the word easy because easy was a high scoring relative salience word in that cross-domain setting. On the other hand, the entropy-based method tends to focus on documents containing target spans that it might have found it hard to classify. So in the R2L example, we see that it's picked a document containing the target span battery life because it's likely to have not seen those kind of target spans in the restaurants domain, but when encountering the laptops domain, that particular target span was hard for the model to predict on. Similarly, for the L2R case, it picked up a food-related target span, lobster bisque, because that's something it encountered in the restaurants domain, but then the model trained on the laptops domain found it hard to predict on because it hadn't seen target spans of that nature. So for our experiments, we use an underlying BERT-based model, although the sampling strategy is encoder agnostic. You could potentially use any model architecture with any underlying encoder. Our model takes as input the entire document and target spans with boundaries. The document is first encoded by BERT, and span boundaries are used to pool tokens to form a span representation. Using the span representation and document as context, we perform multi-class classification to predict sentiment of each span, and we minimize cross-entropy loss across the sentiment labels. For each cross-domain setting, we train the model on label training data of the source domain. And now for the sampling strategy for the target domain, we vary two things. One is the total number of sample documents. So we start with a small number, around 25 documents for restaurants and laptops, 50 for Twitter, and increase that up to about 15% of the target domain training data. We also vary the proportions of documents to sample from each of these strategies. So we start out with picking 80% of the total number of documents from entropy-based strategy and 20% from the RS-based strategy, then move on to 70-30 and 50-50 proportions as well. I'm showing you a few results. There are more in the paper itself. This is an example for the cross-domain setting where the source domain is restaurants, the target domain is laptops. So here we are showing the results of our method and comparing it with two baselines when we vary the number of training documents that were selected from the laptops domain. The red line is our proposed sampling strategy. The two baselines we compare with, one is a random-based baseline, the one in blue, which essentially means we pick the exact same number of documents, but in an entirely randomized fashion. The purple line indicates a sampling strategy which is purely based on the entropy-based selection. So as you can see, our method does outperform both baselines across each set of training documents that are selected here. A more detailed set of results are on the right-hand side. Here we are showing for each cross-domain setting the performance of our method and the baselines for each particular sentiment label. And you can see here as well, our method seems to outperform the baselines across each of the various sentiment labels as well. The other interesting finding that we observed was using our sampling methodology, we were actually able to obtain results pretty close to the fully supervised setting with just a fraction of the training data. And this was very useful for us because this led to reducing annotation cost overall, because this meant that we would not really need the entire training data of the target domain and were able to pick some examples that would help the model perform better with just a fraction of the entire data. I've also presented here a few qualitative examples. This basically shows targets from the test set that were incorrectly labeled by a model which was trained based only on the entropy-based sampling. But when we moved to our sampling strategy, the model was able to then correctly predict those particular target spans. So in conclusion, we were able to propose a sampling strategy which captured both informativeness and representativeness of the target domain. It utilized entropy-based sampling as well as a relative salience-based methodology. We experimented with 3 different academic data sets across 3 cross-domain settings. We find our method to outperform baselines for each sentiment class. It also, interestingly, achieves comparable performance to a fully supervised setting with just a fraction of the training data. Yeah, thanks. That's all I have for today. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions now.